A heavy silence filled the police briefing room, the kind that suffocates rather than soothes. The tension was thick, a storm waiting to break. She stood there, composed, dignified, radiating authority, everything he despised. A black woman in a position of power. A judge. His judge. And for him, that was unacceptable. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug smirk curling on his lips. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of the power he had wielded for years, unchecked and unquestioned. He didn't need to hide his disdain. Not here. Not in front of his people. Tell me something, his voice was slow, taunting, dripping with condescension. Did you get that robe as part of some diversity initiative? Affirmative action, right? A low chuckle rippled through the room, feeding his arrogance. I mean, let's be honest. Someone like you wouldn't last a day in the real world without all these special considerations. Her fingers tightened around the case files in her hands, knuckles whitening, but her face remained unreadable. She had heard it all before. The veiled insults, the not-so-subtle jabs. But this wasn't some nameless stranger on the street. This was a police officer, one with influence, one who thought he was untouchable. She lifted her chin, locking eyes with him. Are you finished? Her voice was steady, unwavering. Not a single crack. The smirk on his face widened, emboldened by the room's silence. Oh, I'm just getting started. You see, I believe in law and order. Real justice. And let's be real, sweetheart, people like you. You wouldn't know a damn thing about justice. You sit behind that bench pretending to be important, but the truth is, you don't belong there. You never did. The air grew heavier. The officers seated around the table stole glances at each other, some shifting uncomfortably, others smirking in silent approval. No one spoke up. No one stopped him. She could feel it, the deep, burning anger coiling inside her, the same one she had carried her entire life, the one she had learned to control, to bury beneath professionalism and poise. But not today. She stepped forward, placing the files onto the table with a deliberate, controlled motion. Officer, she said, voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You may think your badge makes you untouchable. That your uniform gives you the right to speak to me, speak about me, like this. She leaned in slightly, her next words low but sharp. But let me make something very clear. I am not here because someone gave me a favor. I am here because I earned my place. And whether you like it or not, you will respect this court, and you will respect me. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, surprise. Annoyance. A crack in his carefully constructed facade. But it lasted only a second before he scoffed, shaking his head, his smirk never faltering. Respect? He laughed, standing up, pushing his chair back with an unnecessary force that sent it skidding across the floor. He loomed over her, using his height, his presence, as a threat. Respect is earned, sweetheart. And the day I take orders from you is the day hell freezes over. His words hung in the air, a blatant challenge, a declaration of war. She saw the way he was testing her, waiting for her to react, waiting for her to break. But she wouldn't. She never would. She simply smiled. Not the kind that signaled surrender, but the kind that said, you have no idea what's coming. And she was right. Because within hours, everything he thought he knew, about power, about control, about his place in this world, was about to shatter. What happens when the man who thought he was untouchable faces the very justice he mocked? When the woman he tried to humiliate becomes the one deciding his fate? He thought he was the one in control. He had no idea. Stay until the end. You don't want to miss this. At Plough of Twist, we stand against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all its forms. This channel is a space where stories expose truths, deliver justice, and remind us that no one is above consequences. To all our black listeners, know that your voice, existence, and success matter. You are powerful, resilient, and deserving of respect, always. Now, get ready for a story of karma, justice, and power. If you enjoy it, hit the subscribe button and stay with us for more eye-opening twists. Let's dive in. Enjoy the story. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick clouds over Chicago, casting a dull, gray hue across the towering skyline. The air carried the familiar weight of routine, people rushing to work, sirens echoing in the distance, the rhythmic hum of a city that never truly rested. But inside the Cook County Courthouse, there was a different kind of tension, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. It wasn't the kind of chaos found on the streets, where flashing lights and loud voices dominated. No, this was something else entirely, a war of authority, of presence, of power. And today, that battle had a name: Judge Naomi Carter versus Officer Brian Callahan. The courthouse had always been a battlefield, though most never acknowledged it. Inside its halls, justice was not a guarantee, but a privilege, handed down based on status, race, and who had the loudest voice in the room. It was a place where black men and women were often judged before they even spoke, where power was held by those who had never truly felt the weight of injustice. Naomi Carter knew this better than anyone. She had spent years climbing a mountain built to keep her out. From the moment she stepped into law school, she had felt the eyes of doubt, the murmurs of skepticism, the patronizing tones of those who believed she had been given an opportunity rather than earning it. Nothing had ever come easy. She had seen white classmates slide into internships because their fathers knew someone, while she had fought tooth and nail for every opportunity. She had watched mediocre men advance in their careers, while she had to be exceptional just to be acknowledged. She never complained. She worked harder. Naomi wasn't just intelligent, she was relentless. Every case she took, every verdict she delivered, every decision she made was another brick in the foundation she was building for herself. She had to be perfect because people like Brian Callahan were waiting for her to fail. Brian Callahan, the kind of man who thrived in places like this. A white cop with a badge, a legacy, and an ego the size of the city itself. He had been raised in a family of officers, his father, his grandfather, his uncle. He grew up knowing one thing: the system worked for people like him. It had never failed him, never questioned him, never punished him in any meaningful way. He wasn't just part of the system, he was a product of it. For Brian, law and order meant control. It meant people knowing their place. He had built his career on quiet intimidation, on the knowledge that people feared men like him. He was never questioned. Never challenged. Even when his policing turned aggressive, when his authority was pushed beyond the line of reason, there were always people willing to look the other way. They called it necessary force. They called it just doing the job. But Naomi Carter? She called it what it was: abuse of power. And now, she was standing in his briefing room. She had been invited, no, summoned, to give a judicial briefing, a procedural explanation of courtroom processes, something that should have been routine, straightforward. But from the moment she walked in, she could feel the hostility. A room full of officers, arms crossed, faces tight with resentment. She could feel the silent message hanging in the air: you don't belong here. And Brian? He wasn't just another face in the room. He was the ringleader. He sat back in his chair, exuding confidence, arrogance, entitlement. The smirk on his face made Naomi's stomach tighten, but not with fear. With certainty. She had seen men like him her entire life. The ones who thought respect was something they were owed, not something they had to earn. The ones who laughed at the idea of equality. And then he spoke. He leaned forward, the smugness in his voice barely concealed. "Tell me something," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Did you get that robe as part of some diversity initiative? Affirmative action, right?" Laughter. "Not from everyone, but enough." Enough to let her know exactly who was on his side and who was too afraid to go against him. She stood still, her face unreadable. She had learned a long time ago that the moment you let them see your anger, they think they've won. Brian wasn't done. I mean, let's be real. Someone like you wouldn't last a day in the real world without all these special considerations. The air grew thick. Heavy. She could feel the anger bubbling beneath her skin, the familiar burn of being spoken to like she was less than. But Naomi had mastered control. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. Instead, she walked forward, setting her case files down on the table with purpose. "Are you finished?" she asked. Not a tremble in her voice. Not a flicker of doubt. Something in Brian's smirk shifted, just slightly. She didn't wait for an answer. "You may think your badge makes you untouchable. That your uniform gives you the right to speak to me, speak about me, like this." She stepped closer. "But let me make something very clear. I am not here because someone gave me a favor. I am here because I earned my place." Silence. "And whether you like it or not, you will respect this court, and you will respect me." The room was motionless. A charged silence. A moment of undeniable truth. Brian scoffed. Laughed. Loud. Bold. Forced. He pushed his chair back with unnecessary force, standing up to his full height. Towering. Looming. "Respect," he echoed, shaking his head. "Respect is earned, sweetheart. And the day I take orders from you is the day hell freezes over." The room was watching. Waiting. "Naomi?" She smiled. Not in defeat. Not in surrender. But in a way that made his stomach turn. Because she knew something he didn't. Something he would soon learn. Brian Callahan believed in power. He believed in control. He believed that he was the one who made the rules. But what he didn't realize was that the world was changing. That his reign was ending. That the woman he had just tried to humiliate. She was about to become the most powerful force in his life. And he had just made the worst mistake of his career. The tension that had begun in the briefing room didn't fade. It lingered, like a storm waiting to break, humming beneath every interaction, every glance, every unspoken word. The courthouse had always been a place where silent wars were fought, where power was measured in the weight of one's presence, in the authority behind every decision. But now, the battleground had been drawn between two people who refused to back down. Naomi Carter knew what she was up against. Men like Brian Callahan didn't let go of control easily. They pushed. They tested. They looked for cracks, for weakness, for any sign that their presence still dictated the rules. And she had given him nothing. She had stared him down in that briefing room, taken the insult, the mockery, the blatant challenge, and had thrown it right back at him. She had left without giving him the satisfaction of knowing whether his words had affected her, and that had only made it worse. Brian couldn't let it go. It started with small things, subtle, insidious. A case that should have landed on her desk was suddenly reassigned. A request for police body camera footage was delayed without explanation. An officer she had requested for testimony failed to appear in court, claiming he had missed the notice. None of it was enough to call out directly, but Naomi knew what was happening. She had seen it before, officers who didn't like being questioned, who thought the law only applied when it suited them. This was Brian Callahan's way of reminding her who he thought was really in charge. But she didn't flinch. She worked twice as hard, digging through legal loopholes, forcing compliance with every procedure. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing frustration, wouldn't give him the power he wanted. Then, one evening, as she was leaving the courthouse, she saw him waiting by the parking lot. Arms crossed, leaning against a squad car, the streetlights casting sharp shadows across his face. He wasn't in uniform, but he didn't need to be. The message was clear. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight past him, unlocking her car, refusing to acknowledge his presence. But his voice cut through the cold air. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" She stopped, just for a second, before turning around slowly. "If you have something to say, Officer Callahan, say it in court. Otherwise, get out of my way." He pushed off the car, stepping closer. "Oh, I'll say what I need to say, Judge Carter. You see, people like you think you can walk in and change everything. Rewrite the rules. Act like you own the place. But that's not how this works. This city. This system. It was built by men like me. And it doesn't change just because you think it should." She held his gaze, steady, unwavering. "You're right about one thing, Officer Callahan. This system was built by men like you. But that doesn't mean it has to stay that way." His jaw tensed, his fingers curling at his sides. "You're making enemies in the wrong places. And you," she said, stepping closer, voice dropping lower, sharper, "are under the dangerous impression that I'm afraid of you." He chuckled, shaking his head, but there was something behind his eyes, something unsettled. She turned, got into her car, and drove away, but the weight of that conversation stayed with her. Days passed, but the pressure only built. The next time she saw Brian in court, he was there as a witness, testifying in a case involving a police shooting. His version of events was slick, well-rehearsed, carefully crafted to paint himself as the protector, the upholder of justice. But Naomi had read the files. She had seen the footage. And she knew he was lying. She let him speak, let him sit there with all the confidence in the world, thinking he was untouchable. And then she started asking questions. "Officer Callahan, how long was the suspect lying on the ground before you called for medical assistance?" A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "I responded according to protocol." "That's not what I asked." His jaw tightened. "I made the call as soon as I secured the scene. According to the footage, there was a delay of over 5 minutes. Can you explain that?" Silence. "Officer Callahan." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I was following procedure." "Your procedure allowed a man to bleed out on the pavement before calling for help." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Brian exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. "I did my job." Naomi leaned forward. "Then I suggest you start doing it better." It was the first time she saw it, uncertainty. The realization that, for the first time, someone wasn't afraid to push back against him. The tension between them didn't end there. That night, her office received an anonymous complaint questioning her conduct, claiming she had been hostile toward law enforcement. A week later, she found her car parked outside the courthouse with a parking violation that shouldn't have been issued. She knew it was him. And he knew she knew. But Brian was beginning to realize something else: no matter what he did, she wouldn't break. And that was when his frustration turned into something dangerous. One evening, as she walked toward her car, she heard footsteps behind her. Quick, deliberate. She didn't panic. She turned, ready, eyes sharp. Brian stood there, hands in his pockets, but there was something different this time. His usual arrogance had a desperation beneath it. "You think you won, don't you?" Naomi sighed, tired, but not afraid. "Go home, Officer Callahan." But he didn't move. "You don't belong here," he said, voice lower now. "People like you," she cut him off. "People like me? Or women like me? Black women like me? Be specific, Officer Callahan." He scoffed, shaking his head, but he had nothing to say. "That's what I thought," she said. She turned to leave. And then, he grabbed her wrist. It was a mistake. A mistake he didn't realize he had made until the second it happened. Because the next thing he knew, Naomi Carter had pulled away, and every security camera in the parking lot had captured the moment. She took a step back, staring at him with a calm so sharp it could cut through steel. "You just ended your career," she said. "And you don't even know it yet." Brian's face paled for the first time. Because he had felt untouchable for so long. But the fall was coming. And he wasn't ready for it. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like an oppressive force, pressing down on everyone in the room. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation, with tension, with the inevitability of justice catching up to the man who had spent his entire life avoiding it. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the silence so absolute that even the faintest breath could be heard. The only sound was the occasional shuffle of paper, the muted rustling of fabric as someone shifted in their seat, and the slow, deliberate tapping of a pen against the wooden surface of the prosecutor's desk. At the center of it all sat Brian Callahan, the man who had once walked through these halls with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. The man who had spoken to Naomi Carter like she was beneath him, like she was nothing more than an obstacle in his way, like he would never have to face any consequences for the way he moved through the world. Now, there were no badges to protect him, no allies to cover for him, no higher-ups to sweep his actions under the rug. Today, Brian Callahan was not an officer of the law. He was a defendant. And Naomi Carter was the judge who would oversee the very case that would decide his fate. His once proud posture had begun to crack. The arrogance that had been a defining feature of his presence in every room was slipping away, replaced by something else, something colder, tighter, more fragile. His fingers were curled into fists, his jaw was locked, his eyes darting around the courtroom, searching for something, an escape, a loophole, a way out. But there was none. Naomi sat high on the bench, her face composed, her hands steady, her gaze sharp and unwavering. She had waited for this moment, not because she wanted revenge, not because she needed to see him suffer, but because this was what justice looked like. The system that had always protected men like Brian Callahan was now holding him accountable. And he could feel it. The prosecutor stood, voice calm but firm, echoing through the silent room with the weight of undeniable truth. "Officer Callahan, on the night in question, were you aware that your actions were being recorded?" Brian inhaled slowly, his expression unreadable, but Naomi could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched against the table, the way his eyes flickered toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. He knew what was coming. "I wasn't aware of any cameras at the time." A pause. A moment stretched long enough to suffocate. Then, the prosecutor slid a flash drive into the court's display system. A click. A flicker. And then, the screen lit up with the truth. The grainy but unmistakable footage filled the room. The parking lot. The dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows. The tension in the air so thick it was almost visible. There it was. The moment. Brian's hand closing around Naomi's wrist. Her body tensing, pulling back, composed even in that instant. And then, his voice. "You don't belong here." The words echoed through the room, even heavier now than when they had first been spoken. Naomi watched as Brian flinched at the sound of his own voice being played back to him, as if hearing the ugliness of his own words from the outside made it impossible to deny. The courtroom was silent, but the weight of that silence was louder than anything. Naomi felt every eye in the room shift toward Brian, watching for his reaction, waiting for him to try to spin it, to twist the narrative, to slip his way out of accountability the way he always had. But this time, there was no escape. The prosecutor turned back to him, voice unwavering. "Officer Callahan, do you deny that this was you in the footage?" Brian's jaw tightened. He had spent years learning how to manipulate words, how to twist reality to fit his own needs, but this time, there was nowhere left to twist. "I don't remember it happening that way." A ripple of quiet disbelief moved through the courtroom. He was still trying. Even now, even with the evidence right in front of him, he was still trying. The prosecutor didn't even blink. "So you're saying the footage is inaccurate?" Brian's lawyer finally shifted beside him, clearing his throat. His voice was careful, calculated. My client is simply stating that his memory of the event may not align exactly with how it appears on camera. Naomi leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the desk before her. Her voice was steady, sharp. Memory doesn't change reality, Officer Callahan. The camera doesn't lie. Brian's eyes snapped to hers. A flicker of something in them, resentment, frustration, fear. The realization that this time, he wasn't getting away with it. The prosecutor continued. Do you deny that you made physical contact with Judge Carter in this moment? Another silence. Brian shifted, his fingers curling even tighter against the table. He was unraveling. No, he muttered finally. The prosecutor gave no reaction, simply nodded before speaking again. And do you acknowledge that, at the time, Judge Carter was acting within her professional capacity and had not engaged in any behavior that would warrant a physical response from you? A pause. Brian inhaled, slow and measured, as if trying to contain the last shred of control he had left. His knuckles turned white. I was frustrated. It wasn't, the prosecutor cut him off. It wasn't what? A sharp exhale. A moment of silence stretched too long. It wasn't meant to be an attack. The words hung in the air, hollow and meaningless. And then, Naomi spoke, voice carrying across the courtroom, steady as a blade. Intent doesn't erase impact, Officer Callahan. Another murmur through the crowd. The weight of those words sank deep into Brian's chest. The prosecutor turned toward the judge's bench. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The defendant's actions were deliberate, a direct violation of judicial respect and professional conduct, and most importantly, a criminal offense of assault against a sitting judge. Given his history of misconduct and his pattern of abuse of authority, we believe there is ample justification for a conviction. Naomi let the words settle. She could feel Brian watching her, could feel the anger, the panic, the unspoken plea. But there was no fight left in him. She took a slow breath, let her gaze sweep over the room, let herself take in the weight of this moment. This wasn't just about Brian Callahan. This was about every man like him, about every abuse of power that had gone unpunished. This was about justice finally standing on the right side of history. She looked at Brian one last time. Officer Callahan, she said, voice clear, unwavering, unshakable. You once told me that respect is earned. A pause. A breath. A moment so thick with silence it felt like the entire world had stopped. You were right. And with that, the gavel came down. And the man who had once stood above the law finally understood what it meant to be beneath it. The sound of the gavel still echoed in the room, a sharp finality that sliced through the air, severing whatever illusion of control Brian Callahan had left. The weight of the verdict, the realization of what had just happened, pressed down on him with an unbearable force. His breathing was shallow, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table as if clinging to something, anything, to ground himself. But there was nothing. No badge. No authority. No protection. Just the cold, hard truth staring him in the face. Naomi didn't look away. She met his eyes, steady and unflinching, her expression unreadable, but he could feel it, that unspoken acknowledgement that the world had finally shifted beneath him, that for the first time, he was the one with no way out. The murmur of voices around the room was distant, blurred, a low hum of reaction and whispered discussions, but Brian barely heard any of it. His chest felt tight, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. It was supposed to be his world, his rules, his power. He had spent his entire life knowing exactly how to bend things in his favor, how to make people fear him enough to let things slide. But not her. Not Naomi Carter. She had stood in front of him and refused to shrink. She had fought back without raising her voice, without lifting a single finger. And somehow, she had won. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something, but Brian wasn't listening. He couldn't. His throat felt dry, his hands clammy. His body was betraying him in a way it never had before. The slow, creeping sensation of something he didn't recognize. Fear. He turned his gaze toward the bench, where Naomi still sat, composed, unwavering. There was no gloating in her eyes, no smug satisfaction. Just truth. Just finality. Just justice. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The sound of footsteps, deliberate, heavy, filled the space. 2 officers approached. Brian's stomach lurched. He had been on the other side of this too many times to count. He had watched men sit in this same chair, had seen the look in their eyes when they realized their freedom was gone. He had laughed at them. Mocked them. Told them they should have made better choices. And now it was his turn. One of the officers stopped beside him, shifting his weight slightly, but there was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. Stand up. Brian's jaw locked. His limbs felt heavy, foreign, like they no longer belonged to him. He swallowed hard, the reality pressing in, suffocating, unbearable. He didn't move. The second officer stepped closer. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Brian's eyes darted to Naomi again, a flicker of something desperate, something unspoken, something neither of them had words for. Naomi exhaled slowly, tilting her head slightly, watching him, measuring. Then, finally, she spoke. Officer Callahan, you of all people should know how this works. Brian's fingers twitched. His muscles tensed. The humiliation, the anger, the disbelief, it all crashed over him in a suffocating wave. He wanted to fight. He wanted to scream. But the weight of the moment was too much. So he did the only thing he could. He stood. The room shifted as he rose, as the officers reached for him, as the first cool touch of metal met his skin. Handcuffs. Tight. Unforgiving. The same ones he had locked around countless wrists, the same ones he had used to remind people who was in charge. Now, they were his. The irony burned in his chest. He let out a slow, shaky breath, his face blank, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. But his hands were no longer his own. A ripple of hushed murmurs spread through the courtroom as the officers secured the restraints. Brian could feel every single pair of eyes on him. Watching. Waiting. Judging. For the first time in his life, he was the one being dragged out. He kept his gaze forward, rigid, refusing to look at anyone, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing even a flicker of weakness. But as he took the first step, as the officers moved him toward the door, his resolve cracked just enough for his gaze to flicker toward Naomi one last time. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She was simply watching. And that was worse than anything. Because that meant she had already won. And he would never get this moment back. The doors closed behind him. And Naomi Carter exhaled. The weight of the moment settled deep in her chest, heavier than she expected, but right. There was no joy in what had happened today. No sense of victory in watching a man lose everything. But this wasn't about victory. It was about justice finally being served. She glanced down at the desk before her, fingers grazing over the smooth wood, her mind replaying every moment, every decision, every pushback, every moment where she could have walked away, could have let it go, could have decided it wasn't worth the fight. But she hadn't. She had stood her ground. And in the end, the truth had stood with her. The courtroom slowly began to empty, people filing out in quiet murmurs, some in shock, some in satisfaction, some in quiet contemplation. Naomi sat still for a long moment before finally rising to her feet. As she gathered her papers, moving with the steady composure she had always carried, a voice stopped her just as she reached the door. Judge Carter. She turned. One of the younger officers, a black man, no older than 30, standing near the back of the room. He hesitated for a moment, then took a step forward. I just wanted to say, thank you. Naomi studied him for a beat, then gave a small nod, her voice even. Don't thank me. Just remember what you saw today. He nodded. I will. And with that, she walked out of the courtroom. Outside, the city continued as it always did, cars honking, people rushing, the world moving forward. But for Naomi Carter, for the system that had always protected men like Brian Callahan, for the people who had been watching, waiting, hoping for change, something had shifted. The weight of power, of consequence, of accountability, it had finally fallen in the right place. And for the first time, there was no escaping it. The hallway outside the courtroom was unnervingly quiet. The kind of silence that felt almost unnatural in a place where voices usually echoed, where footsteps rang against the marble floors, where tension lived in every crevice. But now, that tension had settled into something heavier, something more final. Naomi Carter stood there for a long moment, breathing in the stillness, letting it settle deep in her bones. It was over. Or at least, this part of it was. She knew the weight of what had happened today wouldn't disappear overnight. It would ripple outward, through the police department, through the courthouse, through the city. Brian Callahan's fall wasn't just about him. It was about the system that had protected him, about the men who had stood beside him, about the quiet, complicit silence that had allowed him to thrive unchecked for years. And now, that silence had been shattered. She could feel the shift. People passed her in the hallway, some avoiding eye contact, others glancing at her with something close to admiration but not quite ready to say it out loud. She didn't need them to. The truth had already spoken for itself. Further down the corridor, she spotted Detective Marcus Reed, one of the few officers she had come to trust over the years, standing near the entrance. He was watching her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But as she approached, he shook his head slightly, exhaling a low breath. You just made a hell of a lot of enemies, he murmured, voice low enough that only she could hear. Naomi met his gaze evenly. That was never the point. Doesn't matter. Callahan wasn't just another cop. He was part of something bigger. You think they'll just let this go? His tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried a warning beneath it. She already knew the answer. Of course, they wouldn't. Men like Brian Callahan didn't fall without people scrambling to pick up the pieces, to protect whatever remained of their power. She could already imagine the closed-door meetings, the whispered discussions, the desperate attempts to spin the narrative. They would call it a mistake. They would say he had been treated unfairly. They would try to make him a martyr for the wrong cause. But none of that would change the facts. Let them be angry, she said simply. I didn't come here to make them comfortable. Reed studied her for a long moment before shaking his head again. You really don't flinch, do you? I don't have that luxury. He let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. You know, the department's already trying to figure out what to do with him. No one wants to deal with the fallout. He's not their problem anymore, Naomi said, tilting her head slightly. He's the system's problem now. Reed sighed. That's exactly what they don't want to hear. She wasn't surprised. There was never a shortage of people willing to protect the ones who had spent years bending the rules in their favor. But today, the rules had finally bent back. Reed shifted slightly, glancing toward the door where Brian had been let out just minutes earlier. You think he's even processed what just happened? Naomi considered the question. She had seen the look in Brian's eyes as the verdict had been read, as the handcuffs had closed around his wrists, as he had been led out of the courtroom. It wasn't just shock. It was disbelief. A man who had spent his entire life believing himself untouchable was now facing the reality he had always assumed was reserved for other people. He'll process it when he wakes up tomorrow and realizes there's no badge to hide behind, she said. Reed's expression darkened slightly. And when that happens? Naomi exhaled slowly. That's up to him. They both knew the truth. Some men learned. Some didn't. Some adapted. Some let the weight of their downfall consume them. But either way, Brian Callahan's time as a man above the law was over. Reed gave her a small nod before stepping away, disappearing down the corridor. Naomi lingered a moment longer before turning toward the exit. She needed air. Outside, the city felt different. The same rush of people, the same movement, the same constant energy, but underneath it all, something had shifted. She wasn't naive enough to believe that a single conviction would change everything, that corruption would disappear overnight, that the struggle was over. But this was proof that change was possible. That the system wasn't invincible. That even men like Brian Callahan could fall. She had barely taken 2 steps before she heard a voice behind her. Judge Carter. She turned. A woman, mid-40s, poised, well-dressed but with tired eyes, the kind of tired that came from carrying too much for too long. She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to say what she had come here to say. My son, she finally said. 2 years ago. He was arrested. Callahan was one of the officers. Said my boy resisted. But he didn't. He was just scared. Naomi felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The woman let out a breath. I just wanted to say thank you. Naomi studied her, taking in the quiet pain, the strength that had been built through necessity. I'm sorry for what happened to your son. The woman nodded, swallowing hard. They let him go. Eventually. But he was never the same after that. Naomi had no words that would change what had already been done. But she could offer one truth. Callahan won't do this to anyone else ever again. A flicker of something crossed the woman's face, relief, gratitude, a small piece of peace. She gave Naomi a small nod before stepping back into the crowd. Naomi stood there for a long moment, watching the city move around her, the weight of everything settling in. Somewhere, in a holding cell, Brian Callahan was experiencing his first night without power, without privilege, without protection. He would sit there, in the silence, in the cold, realizing that for the first time in his life, he was truly alone. And maybe, just maybe, he would finally understand. The hum of the fluorescent light overhead was relentless, casting an artificial glow over the stark gray walls of the holding cell. The air was stale, thick with the scent of sweat, old metal, and institutional sterility, the kind of atmosphere that seeped into the skin, making it impossible to ignore where you were. The walls were bare, lifeless, indifferent to the people who sat within them, trapping them in a place where time slowed to a crawl. Brian Callahan sat motionless on the hard metal bench, his back pressed against the cold surface, his hands resting on his knees, his stare locked onto the wall across from him. But he wasn't seeing the wall. He was seeing everything that had led him here. The courtroom. The jury. The way their eyes had bored into him as the evidence was played, the way his own voice had filled the room, undeniable, inescapable. You don't belong here. He had said it with such certainty, such conviction, never once considering the possibility that those words would come back to haunt him. Now, he was the one who didn't belong. Not here. Not anywhere. The reality was beginning to settle in his chest, heavy and suffocating. He had spent years believing that this place was reserved for other people. People who made bad choices. People who didn't follow the rules. People who deserved to be here. But what did that make him? The thought sent a sharp, cold sensation through his body, something that felt too close to fear, too close to something he had spent his entire life avoiding. His mind kept replaying the moment the verdict had been read. The way the words had hung in the air, solid, irreversible. Guilty. He had expected outrage. A last-minute save. Some kind of intervention from the people who had always been there to shield him. But no one had come. There had been no protests in his defense. No public outcry about how unfairly he had been treated. Because no one cared. The realization sent a slow, creeping numbness through him. He had built his entire existence around control. Around knowing the system, bending it when necessary, ensuring that he was always on the right side of the bars. And now, he was sitting in a cell, waiting to be processed like every man he had ever arrested. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Slow. Unhurried. The sound of authority approaching. The buzz of the door unlocking sent a jolt through his spine, but he didn't move, didn't react. A chair scraped against the floor. Someone sat across from him. He knew who it was before she even spoke. Officer Callahan. The title made his jaw tighten. That wasn't his name anymore. Naomi Carter sat across from him, calm, composed, completely unaffected by the walls around her. She didn't belong here. But she had power here. And that fact burned more than anything else. He exhaled through his nose, but he didn't respond. Didn't acknowledge her. She didn't fill the silence. She let it stretch, let it settle, let it become unbearable. She had all the time in the world. Do you understand where you are? The question landed like a punch. His fingers twitched, but he forced his hands to remain still. His mind screamed at him to ignore her, to shut her out. But the words dug in anyway, because he did understand. More than he wanted to. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady, controlled. Do you understand what's happening to you? His throat tightened. He had asked that same question before. He had been on the other side of this table, watching the people in front of him squirm, watching them realize their life was about to change forever. Now, it was his turn. You think this is funny, don't you? His voice came out rough, jagged, nothing like the man he had been. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him. No. There's nothing funny about this. His eyes snapped to hers, sharp, bitter. Then why are you here? A slow breath. Measured. Unshaken. I wanted to see if you had anything to say. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Like what? An apology? If that's what you have to offer. His hands curled into fists. I didn't, he stopped himself, jaw clenching, his breath unsteady. You didn't what? His stomach twisted. You think this changes anything? His voice was tight, barely concealing the storm raging beneath it. You think putting me in here fixes the system? You think one conviction means anything? Naomi didn't blink. No. But it means something to the people you hurt. It means something to the people who watched you get away with it for years. And it means something to you, whether you want to admit it or not. His chest burned. I didn't hurt you. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened. No. You didn't lay a hand on me. He swallowed, but it felt like razor blades down his throat. You didn't try to intimidate me, she continued, voice unwavering. You didn't use your badge as a weapon. You didn't humiliate, belittle, abuse your power, knowing no one would stop you. His fingers twitched again. She sat back slightly, watching him, weighing his silence. And yet, here you are. The words hit harder than they should have. His entire life, he had told himself that the system worked. That if someone ended up in a cell, they deserved to be there. That if they were sitting across from a judge, it was because they had made bad choices. So what did that make him? His breath was shallow. You think I'm some kind of monster, don't you? Naomi's expression didn't change, but when she spoke, her voice was softer. I think you're a man who finally has to answer for what he's done. His chest tightened. For years, he had walked through the courthouse with confidence, with ease, knowing it was his domain. He had carried himself like a man who owned these halls. And now, he was sitting on the other side of the table, realizing how small this room really was. Naomi stood. I didn't come here to argue with you, Callahan. I didn't come here to punish you, either. The system you believed in is doing that for me. She moved toward the door, then paused. When she turned back, her expression had softened. Just slightly. You have a choice, she said quietly. You can sit here and let this eat you alive. Or you can figure out what kind of man you're going to be when you walk out of here. His throat was tight. She nodded once, then knocked on the door. A second later, it buzzed open. She stepped out without looking back. Brian sat there long after she was gone, staring at the table, at the walls, at the nothingness ahead of him. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what came next. The walls of the holding cell felt smaller now, as if they were closing in inch by inch, suffocating in their silence. Brian Callahan sat in the same position, on the same hard metal bench, staring at the same dull gray wall. But everything had changed. His mind was a storm, a chaotic loop of moments crashing into each other. The courtroom. The verdict. The weight of the handcuffs on his wrists. The murmurs, the eyes on him, the realization that his entire life had been reduced to this room, this uniform, this silence. The moment Naomi Carter walked out of that door and left him sitting there with nothing but his own reflection. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there, but the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway pulled him from the emptiness. The door buzzed, then clicked open, and for the first time since the verdict, he felt something close to instinctual panic. A figure stepped in. Not Naomi Carter this time. His lawyer. A man who had once spoken to him with easy confidence, the kind of assuredness that came with representing a man like Brian Callahan. A man who had assumed this would all be a misunderstanding, a situation easily controlled, easily dismissed. But now, his face was tight, his shoulders stiff, his movements carrying the weight of failure. Brian exhaled sharply, running his tongue over his teeth. How bad is it? His lawyer sat across from him, adjusting his cuffs, his every movement deliberate. Bad. Brian let out a slow breath. He already knew. He just wanted to hear someone else say it. You're looking at years, the lawyer continued, his voice calm, professional, like this was just another case, another client, another problem to handle. It won't be decades, but you're not walking away from this in a few months, either. The prosecution pushed hard, and the judge, well, you know the judge. Brian clenched his jaw. Yeah. I know the judge. The lawyer sighed, glancing around the small, lifeless room. There's still an appeal process, but don't expect any miracles. The evidence is airtight, the jury made their decision, and let's be honest, you're not exactly a sympathetic defendant. Brian scoffed, shaking his head. You don't say. His lawyer studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he leaned forward slightly. I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Are you ready for what's coming? Brian met his gaze, and for the first time in his life, he had no answer. Ready? For what? For prison. For the loss of everything he had built. For the realization that he had spent his entire life on the wrong side of a system he thought would always protect him. He had seen it before, men sitting across from him in rooms just like this one, their hands shaking, their eyes darting toward the door as if they could still escape. He had laughed at them, at their desperation, their weakness. Now, he was them. The lawyer exhaled, rubbing his temple. Look, Brian, I'm not going to lie to you. You're about to experience the other side of the system you used to enforce. And it's going to be different for you. You know that, right? Brian's fingers curled into fists. Of course, he knew. He wasn't just any prisoner. He was a cop. And cops in prison weren't like everyone else. They were targets. He swallowed, forcing himself to keep his expression blank. How long do I have before sentencing? 3 weeks. Brian nodded slowly, letting the number settle. 3 weeks. That was it. That was all the freedom he had left. His lawyer studied him carefully, as if waiting for something, some reaction. When Brian didn't give him one, he let out a low breath and leaned back in his chair. "There's one more thing." Brian's gaze flicked up. "What?" The lawyer hesitated, then reached into his briefcase, pulling out a small, folded note. "She left this for you." The air in the room shifted. Brian's entire body went still. He didn't have to ask who she was. The note sat between them, a simple, unassuming piece of paper, yet it carried the weight of everything. Naomi Carter had written him a note. His pulse was a steady, slow thud in his ears as he stared at it, his mind racing. What could she possibly have left for him? A final reminder of his failure? A last word before she wiped her hands clean of him? His lawyer waited, then finally slid the note across the table. "Up to you if you want to read it." Brian hesitated for just a second before grabbing it. His fingers unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the neat, precise handwriting. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. "You once told me that respect is earned. You were right. But so is redemption." No signature. No explanation. Just those words. Brian stared at them, rereading them over and over, his mind unable to process what they meant. He had expected anger. Expected her to make sure he knew exactly why he was here, exactly what he had done. But this? His throat tightened. He didn't know what he had wanted from her. Maybe he had wanted her to gloat. Maybe he had wanted her to hate him, because that would have been easier than whatever this was. Redemption. His chest ached in a way he didn't recognize, something raw, something unfamiliar, something he didn't know how to name. The lawyer watched him, waiting. Brian folded the note slowly, pressing his fingers against the creases, his pulse a slow, steady drum against his ribs. He didn't say anything. He didn't react. But for the first time since this all started, he felt something crack. Something shift. And for the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this didn't have to be the end of him. Maybe, this was the beginning of something else. Brian Callahan stepped through the gates of the prison and into the open air for the first time in 2 years. The sun was too bright, the air too sharp against his skin, like the world itself had changed while he had been locked away. In truth, nothing had changed, the city still moved at its usual pace, people still walked with purpose, cars still honked in frustration, life continued as if he had never existed. But he had changed. 2 years inside had stripped him down to nothing. He had walked into that prison believing he was still someone, still a man with power, with control, with the ability to dictate how the world saw him. That illusion had lasted all of a week before reality beat it out of him. Inside, he wasn't Officer Callahan. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a man who commanded authority. He was just another inmate. And worse, he was a cop in prison. He learned quickly that power was an illusion when you had no one left to wield it over. The same people he had once arrested, the same men he had humiliated on the streets, the same faces he had looked at with indifference from the other side of the bars, they were his reality now. And there was no escaping that. The first few months were the hardest. The constant tension, the way he always had to watch his back, the way every interaction carried the unspoken threat of what could happen if he let his guard down. He had thought he knew fear before, he hadn't. But over time, something strange happened. The more invisible he became, the more time he had to sit with himself, with his past, with the undeniable truth of who he had been. And he hated that man. For the first time, without the uniform, without the badge, without the weight of a system that had always protected him, he was forced to see himself for who he truly was. And it made him sick. The anger, the superiority, the quiet belief that he had been untouchable, it all felt like a different lifetime now. A different person. But the world wouldn't see it that way. He knew the moment he walked out of those gates, he was nothing. No job, no future, no way to rebuild what had been burned to the ground. He had two choices: let the weight of that destroy him, or figure out how to move forward. He chose the latter. It wasn't easy. No one wanted to hire an ex-cop, especially not one whose name had been dragged through every headline in the country. But there were places that didn't ask questions. A rundown mechanic shop on the west side of Chicago took him in, put a wrench in his hand, and let him work. It was the first time in his life he had to prove himself without his past doing the work for him. It was exhausting. Humbling. Necessary. The first time he saw Naomi Carter again, it wasn't planned. A year after his release, he was walking down a quiet street, minding his own business, when he saw her stepping out of the courthouse. He froze. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a second, he considered walking away. What could he possibly say to her? But then, as if sensing him, she turned. Their eyes met. He saw the flicker of recognition, the brief pause before she tilted her head slightly, waiting. Waiting for him to say something. For the first time in his life, he felt small in front of her, not because of her position, not because of what she had done, but because she had been right about him all along. He took a slow breath and stepped forward. "I read your note," he said, voice steady. "Every day." She didn't react. Didn't soften. Didn't smile. "And?" she asked. He exhaled. "I don't expect you to believe me, but I'm trying." A long pause. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. "Good," she said simply. And just like that, she turned and walked away. No lecture. No forgiveness. No conversation about what had happened. Just a single word. But it meant more than anything else he had ever heard. Because it meant she saw the change. Not in a way that erased the past, not in a way that absolved him of what he had done, but in a way that acknowledged the only thing that mattered: he was not the same man. She hadn't saved him. She hadn't given him some speech that turned him into a better person overnight. She had simply given him a choice. And he had made the right one. Because redemption wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about wiping the slate clean. It was about learning to live with what you had done and deciding to be better anyway. He was never going to be a hero. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't the villain anymore. Justice. Power. Redemption. What do those words mean to you? For years, Brian Callahan thought justice was something he controlled. That power was something he was born into. That redemption was something other people had to earn. But justice isn't owned. Power is an illusion. And redemption? Redemption is a choice. Naomi Carter didn't have to fight him. She didn't have to destroy him. She only had to let the truth speak for itself. And the truth is, when the system finally held him accountable, he had no one left to hide behind. So now, I'll ask you, what does justice look like to you? Let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Naomi Carter's place? Do you think Callahan deserved a second chance? And if you want more stories with impact, stories that make you question everything you think you know, subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because the best stories are the ones you never see coming.